Hello there, and welcome to the Snoozy Explorer. Tonight, we are drifting back through time to a period when the world moved differently than it does now. A time when letters traveled by ship, when calculations were done by hand, and when the most profound discoveries unfolded not in an instant, but across years of quiet, persistent work. This is a story about patience, about rooms filled with chalkboards and cigarette smoke, about people who understood something before the rest of the world could imagine it. It is about how the atomic bomb came to exist, not through sudden inspiration, but through the slow accumulation of knowledge, concern, and methodical effort. If you find comfort in these longer explorations, I invite you to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Allow your breathing to find its own rhythm, and let your mind wander back to a world that was about to cross a threshold it could never uncross. Let's begin. In the late 1930s, the world felt both vast and knowable. Cities hummed with streetcars and radio broadcasts. Newspapers arrived each morning with yesterday's events printed in neat columns. People gathered in cafes and concert halls. Children attended school. Farmers tended fields. Life moved forward with a kind of predictable momentum, shaped by seasons and routines that had existed for generations. Wars had been fought before. Economic struggles were not new. Yet beneath this surface continuity, something quieter was happening. In laboratories scattered across Europe and America, a small community of physicists was asking questions about the nature of matter itself. These were not questions driven by conquest or profit. They were questions born from curiosity. What are atoms made of? How do they hold together? What happens when you split them apart? For decades, atoms had been theoretical constructs, useful for explaining chemistry and the behavior of gases, but not something anyone could see or touch. They were ideas supported by mathematics and careful observation. The scientists who studied them were often isolated from the rest of society, working in universities with modest budgets, publishing papers that only a few hundred people in the world could fully understand. Their work felt distant from politics, from military concerns, from the daily struggles of ordinary life. Physics, in those years, was still largely an academic pursuit. It was about understanding, not application. A physicist might spend years refining a single experiment, measuring how particles behaved under certain conditions, writing equations that described patterns no one had seen before. The laboratories were small. The equipment was often built by hand. Collaboration happened through letters that took weeks to arrive, through conferences where a few dozen specialists gathered to debate subtle points of theory. There was elegance in this work, a sense that the universe was revealing itself slowly, and that patience was rewarded with insight. Atoms, to these scientists, were tiny solar systems. At the center sat the nucleus, dense and positively charged, containing nearly all the mass. Circling around it were electrons, light and negative, held in place by electromagnetic attraction. This model explained much of what had been observed. It accounted for chemical bonding, for the way elements emitted light, for the periodic table structure. But it also raised deeper questions. What held the nucleus itself together? Protons carried positive charge and should repel each other violently. Yet they stayed packed tightly in the nucleus. Something else had to be at work. Some force stronger than electromagnetism, operating only at extremely short distances. As the 1930s progressed, understanding of the nucleus deepened. Neutrons were discovered, particles with mass but no charge, sitting alongside protons in the nucleus. This explained isotopes, versions of the same element with different weights. It also suggested that the nucleus was not a simple, static ball, but a dynamic system held together by forces that behaved differently than anything seen before. Physicists began bombarding nuclei with particles, watching what happened when atoms were disturbed. Sometimes nuclei absorbed the incoming particle. Sometimes they ejected something else. Occasionally, they transformed into different elements entirely. Alchemy, long dismissed as fantasy, was happening in laboratories, atom by atom. The work was meticulous. A single experiment might take months to set up. Detecting the results required instruments so sensitive that vibrations from a passing truck could ruin hours of data collection. Scientists learned to work at night, when the world was quieter. They developed techniques for isolating tiny samples, for shielding their equipment from stray radiation, for counting individual particle interactions. Progress was measured not in breakthroughs, but in incremental improvements. A measurement slightly more precise than the last one. A theory that predicted outcomes a bit more accurately. This was science as craft, requiring patience, skill, and an almost meditative focus on detail. Yet even in this quiet, methodical world, there were moments when something unexpected appeared. Results that didn't fit existing models. Behaviors that seemed impossible according to current understanding. These anomalies were not ignored. They were pursued carefully, checked and rechecked, discussed in letters and at conferences. Science moved forward not by abandoning old ideas carelessly, but by accumulating evidence that gradually made old ideas untenable. Change happened slowly, through collective agreement rather than individual revelation. In this context, atoms were not weapons. They were puzzles. The energy locked inside them was a theoretical quantity, something calculated on paper but not something anyone imagined harnessing. The numbers were impressive, certainly. Einstein's equation, equals mc squared, suggested that mass and energy were interchangeable and that even a tiny amount of mass. What Hahn and Stresemann found, however, did not match expectations. After bombarding uranium, they performed careful chemical analysis of the products. They expected to find elements close to uranium on the periodic table, perhaps elements with 90 or 91 protons, the kind of products that would result from the uranium nucleus losing a few particles. Instead, they found barium. Barium has only 56 protons, less than 2/3 the number in uranium. This was baffling. How could a uranium nucleus lose so much mass? The only explanation that fit the data was almost too strange to believe. The uranium nucleus had not just chipped off a few particles. It had split roughly in half. The neutron impact had caused the entire nucleus to break apart into two large fragments. This was nuclear fission, though they did not call it that immediately. Hahn wrote to his former colleague, Lise Meitner, who had fled Germany for Sweden because of her Jewish ancestry. He described the results and asked for her interpretation. Meitner, working with her nephew Otto Frisch, also a physicist, began calculating what must have happened. What Meitner and Frisch realized was that when a uranium nucleus split, it would release an enormous amount of energy. The binding energy that held the nucleus together would be suddenly freed. Using Einstein's equation, they calculated that a single fission event would release about 200 million electron volts of energy. This was a tiny amount in absolute terms, but it was millions of times more energy than came from a chemical reaction involving the same number of atoms. If you could make many uranium nuclei split simultaneously, the energy release would be substantial. More troublingly, they realized that fission might release additional neutrons. These neutrons could strike other uranium nuclei, causing them to split, which would release more neutrons, which would cause more fissions. A chain reaction. This realization was quiet and mathematical, not dramatic. Meitner and Frisch sat in the snow outside a small Swedish village, working through the calculations on paper. They were not thinking about weapons. They were trying to understand what their colleagues in Berlin had observed. But as they worked through the physics, the implications became unavoidable. If you assembled enough uranium in one place, and if you could initiate fission in just a few nuclei, the reaction might sustain itself. Each fission would trigger more fissions, and the energy would multiply exponentially. The reaction would happen incredibly fast, perhaps in millionths of a second. The energy release would be explosive. News of fission spread rapidly through the small physics community. Papers were published in early 1939. Physicists in laboratories across Europe and America began replicating the experiments, confirming that uranium did indeed split when bombarded with neutrons. The results were unambiguous. Fission was real. The energy release was measurable. And the possibility of a chain reaction was not just theoretical speculation, it was physics that followed naturally from what had been observed. What made this discovery unsettling was its timing. Europe was on the brink of war. Germany was rearming and expanding aggressively. Many physicists had already fled fascist regimes. They understood that scientific knowledge could be weaponized. The discovery of fission was published openly, following scientific tradition, but immediately some scientists began to worry about who else was reading those papers. If physicists in free countries understood the implications of fission, physicists in Germany certainly did as well. The concern was not abstract. Germany had excellent scientists, world-class laboratories, and now a government with expansionist ambitions and no moral constraints. If Germany developed a nuclear weapon first, the consequences would be catastrophic. This was not paranoia. It was a reasonable assessment based on recent history and current events. Scientists who had watched Germany persecute colleagues, invade neighbors, and embrace ideology over truth had no illusions about how such a regime might use ultimate destructive power. Yet even with this concern, action was not immediate. Scientists are not generals or politicians. They think in terms of experiments and evidence, not strategy and urgency. The initial response was to calculate more carefully to see if a chain reaction was actually feasible. Natural uranium contains two isotopes. Most of it is uranium-238, which does not fission easily. Only about 0.7% is uranium-235, which does fission readily when struck by slow neutrons. This was a critical detail. For a chain reaction, you needed enough uranium-235 in one place that neutrons released from one fission would likely strike another uranium-235 nucleus before escaping or being absorbed by something else. Calculations suggested this was possible, but not easy. You would need to either separate uranium-235 from uranium-238, enriching the concentration of the fissile isotope, or you would need to use a different element altogether. It turned out that when uranium-238 absorbed a neutron, it sometimes transmuted into a new element, plutonium, which also underwent fission. Plutonium did not exist in nature. It would have to be created in nuclear reactors, then separated chemically from uranium. Both paths, enrichment and plutonium production, were technically challenging on a scale no one had attempted before. The early calculations were done on paper, sitting at desks or standing at blackboards. There were no computers, no simulations. Every step required understanding physics deeply enough to know which effects mattered and which could be neglected. Neutron behavior, cross-sections, diffusion rates, critical mass, all of these concepts had to be worked out from first principles or rough estimates. The physicists doing this work were solving problems that had never been posed before, using mathematical tools developed for other purposes. It was slow, difficult, and uncertain. What made the discovery of fission truly pivotal was not just that it released energy, but that it released controllable energy through a process that could potentially be scaled. A single nucleus splitting was insignificant, but if you could arrange conditions so that each fission caused two more fissions, and each of those caused two more, the numbers grew exponentially. After 10 generations, roughly 1,000 nuclei would have split. After 20 generations, 1,000,000. After 80 generations, more than all the atoms in a kilogram of uranium. And all of this could happen in less time than a human eye could detect. The physicists understood the mathematics of exponential growth. They had studied chain reactions in other contexts, like chemical explosions or biological population growth. But this was different. Nuclear chain reactions were faster and more energetic than anything humanity had encountered. The gap between calculation and reality felt smaller than usual. If the equations said a bomb was possible, then a bomb was probably possible. There was no obvious physical law preventing it, no impossible requirement. Just difficult engineering. This is when scientific curiosity began to transmute into fear. The same discovery that was intellectually thrilling, revealing a new layer of nature's structure, was also deeply troubling. Knowledge that expanded human understanding also expanded human capacity for destruction. The scientists felt this tension acutely. They had spent their lives believing that understanding nature was inherently good, that more knowledge led to better outcomes. Now they were confronting the possibility that some knowledge carried dark potential, that understanding nuclear physics might lead directly to the worst weapon imaginable. There were debates in private, in letters, at small gatherings. Should the discovery be kept secret? Could it be kept secret? Was it already too late, given that the basic physics was now published? Some argued for self-censorship, for not publishing further findings that might help weapons development. Others felt that science required openness, that secrecy would betray fundamental values. The debate was never fully resolved, but it became moot as governments began taking interest. Word reached a few key scientists who had connections to people in power. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who had fled Europe, was particularly alarmed. He understood both the physics and the political situation. He began trying to warn people who might be able to act. But governments moved slowly in 1939. The US was not yet at war. Military budgets were limited. The idea of a nuclear weapon seemed too speculative to warrant major investment. Official interest was polite but cautious. What none of the scientists wanted was for Germany to build the bomb first. This was the nightmare scenario that drove much of what followed. Not ambition, not curiosity, but fear. Fear that their knowledge would be used by people with no moral restraint. Fear that the careful, methodical world of academic physics had accidentally opened a door to something monstrous. The discovery of fission was just a discovery, morally neutral in itself. But the context in which it occurred, the state of the world in 1939, transformed it immediately into something urgent and dangerous. The experiments continued, of course. Scientists in multiple countries tried to determine exactly what was needed for a chain reaction. They measured neutron production rates. They calculated critical masses. They explored different configurations and materials. This work was still mostly academic, published in journals, discussed openly at conferences. But increasingly, there was awareness that this openness would not last. That soon, perhaps very soon, this work would move behind closed doors, become classified, be removed from the free exchange of ideas that had nurtured it. The discovery that changed everything was not a moment of inspiration. It was the culmination of decades of patient work. Rutherford's discovery of the nucleus in 1911. Chadwick's discovery of the neutron in 1932. Years of experiments bombarding elements, studying radioactivity, refining measurements. Fission did not appear out of nowhere. It was revealed through systematic investigation, through the gradual refinement of experimental technique and theoretical understanding. When Hahn and Strassmann saw barium where they expected to see something else, they recognized it only because decades of chemistry had taught them how to identify elements with certainty. This is an important point because the atomic bomb is often portrayed as the product of genius or sudden insight. In reality, it was the product of collective, incremental progress. Hundreds of scientists, over many decades, each contributing a piece. The bomb became possible not because someone had a brilliant idea one afternoon, but because the scientific community had slowly, methodically, built the knowledge base that made it inevitable. Once fission was discovered, once the physics was understood, the bomb was just engineering. Difficult engineering, but not impossible engineering. And so the world changed, not with a bang, but with careful measurements in a Berlin laboratory, followed by calculations in the snow of Sweden, followed by confirmation experiments in laboratories around the world, followed by quiet, increasingly worried conversations among scientists who realized what they had found. The discovery that changed everything did not feel world-changing at the time. It felt like one more piece of a puzzle that had been decades in the assembly. Only gradually did the implications become clear. Only slowly did the fear begin to spread. The fear did not travel dramatically. It moved through letters, through conversations after seminars, through carefully worded warnings passed from scientist to scientist. In early 1939, much of the world remained unaware that nuclear fission had even been discovered. It was technical knowledge, published in specialized journals, understood by perhaps a few hundred people globally. But within that small community, there was growing unease, particularly among those who had fled Europe and now watched events there with alarm. Leo Szilard was one of the first to truly grasp the implications, not just scientifically but politically. Born in Hungary, educated in Germany, he had left Europe in 1933 after Hitler came to power. By 1939 he was in the United States, working at Columbia University. Szilard had a restless mind, always leaping ahead to consequences and possibilities. When he learned of fission, he immediately understood the potential for both energy production and weapons. More importantly, he understood that if he could see this, so could scientists still in Germany. Szilard tried to organize voluntary censorship among physicists. He contacted colleagues, suggesting they stop publishing findings related to fission until the political situation clarified. Some agreed, but the effort was half-hearted and ultimately failed. Science depended on communication. Withholding findings felt wrong, almost a betrayal of the discipline's core values. And there was doubt about whether secrecy would matter. The basic physics was already published. Anyone competent could reproduce the experiments. Holding back further details might delay things slightly, but could not prevent others from reaching the same conclusions. Frustrated by the lack of official interest, Szilard conceived a bold plan. He would reach out to the one scientist whose name carried weight beyond the physics community, someone whose word might be taken seriously by government officials. Albert Einstein. Einstein was the most famous scientist in the world, a Nobel laureate whose work had revolutionized physics. He was also Jewish, an émigré from Germany, someone who understood the stakes personally. Szilard traveled to Einstein's summer residence on Long Island in July 1939. He brought along another Hungarian physicist, Eugene Wigner. They explained fission, explained the possibility of a chain reaction, explained their concern that Germany might be pursuing a bomb. Einstein, who had not been following nuclear physics closely, was startled. He immediately grasped the danger. If what they said was true, and if Germany succeeded in building such a weapon, the war that was obviously coming would be decided before it began. Together they drafted a letter addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt. The letter was careful and restrained, as befitted communication between a scientist and a head of state. It explained that recent work in nuclear physics had shown that uranium might be turned into a new source of energy and also into extremely powerful bombs. It noted that Germany had stopped selling uranium from Czech mines, suggesting possible interest in this area. It recommended that the U.S. government take action to secure uranium supplies and to fund research into chain reactions. The letter was dated August 2, 1939, but it did not reach Roosevelt immediately. It needed to be delivered through channels that would give it proper attention. Szilard enlisted Alexander Sachs, an economist and informal advisor to Roosevelt, to hand-deliver the letter personally. But Sachs waited, wanting the right moment. By the time he finally delivered it in October, Germany had invaded Poland and Europe was at war. Roosevelt's response was measured. He understood the concern but was not panicked. He convened a small advisory committee, informally called the Uranium Committee, to investigate the matter. The committee was given modest funding, just $6,000 initially, enough to support preliminary research but hardly a crash program. The government's caution is understandable. The claims seemed speculative. Bombs from atoms? It sounded like science fiction. And even if it were possible, how long would it take? Years? Decades? The war unfolding in Europe needed attention now, not theoretical future weapons. Through 1940 and into 1941, work on uranium proceeded slowly in the United States. Several research groups received small contracts to explore different aspects of the problem. At Columbia, Fermi and others studied neutron behavior in uranium. At Berkeley, scientists investigated isotope separation. At Princeton and elsewhere, theorists refined calculations of what would be needed for a bomb. The work was careful and methodical, but it was not urgent. Not yet. Meanwhile, intelligence reports suggested that Germany was indeed interested in uranium. Scientists there had recognized the same possibilities. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, where fission had been discovered, was pursuing research. German physicists were competent and well-funded. They had access to uranium. They had the scientific infrastructure. The nightmare scenario Szilard and others feared was not paranoid fantasy. It was happening. What finally shifted American efforts from cautious research to urgent program was the entrance of the United States into the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed everything. Suddenly the US was fighting not just philosophically but actually, with troops and ships and planes. The war was no longer something happening elsewhere. It was immediate and total. In this context, the atomic bomb became not an interesting possibility but a potential necessity. Even before Pearl Harbor, though, momentum had been building. A report written in the summer of 1941 by the Maud Committee in Britain had concluded that an atomic bomb was feasible and could be built within a few years. This report reached American officials and lent credibility to what had seemed like speculation. If British scientists, sober and methodical, believed the bomb was possible, then it had to be taken seriously. In late 1941, the US government decided to pursue the bomb as a significant project, though still not the vast effort it would become. Funding increased. Coordination improved. But it was not until 1942, with America fully at war and desperate for any advantage, that the project transformed into something genuinely large-scale. What had begun as a handful of scientists with a worry became an industrial and scientific undertaking involving thousands of people and enormous resources. The transition from fear to action was not instantaneous. It took months of advocacy, of reports written and reviewed, of committees formed and meetings held. Bureaucracies do not move quickly, even in wartime. Every step required convincing someone new, someone who had not spent years thinking about nuclear physics, that this strange project deserved priority over more conventional military needs. The scientists pushing for action had to translate technical details into implications, to make the abstract concrete, to communicate urgency without seeming alarmist. What helped was that many of the key decision-makers were themselves scientifically literate or at least respectful of science. Vannevar Bush, who headed the Office of Scientific Research and Development, understood the potential. James Conant, a chemist and president of Harvard, was deeply involved. These were people who could read technical reports and assess plausibility. They provided a bridge between the scientists and the military and political leadership who would ultimately make decisions. At the same time, Oppenheimer was not naive about the human dimensions of the project. He knew that people needed community, that they could not live solely for work without burning out. He encouraged social gatherings, supported the creation of schools and recreational facilities for the families that would eventually live at Los Alamos. He wanted people to feel like they were part of something, not just isolated individuals working on separate pieces. This community building was not incidental. It was essential to maintaining morale through years of difficult, often frustrating work. Oppenheimer was also aware of the moral weight of what they were building. Unlike some participants who focused narrowly on technical challenges and left ethical questions for later, Oppenheimer thought about consequences from the beginning. He did not avoid or deny what the bomb would do. He understood that they were creating a device designed to kill enormous numbers of people instantly. This knowledge did not paralyze him, but it shaped his approach. He was not cavalier. He did not treat the project as just another scientific challenge. He carried the weight of it visibly. His contradictions made him effective. He could be ruthless in pushing for results while also being sensitive to individual struggles. He could hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding why someone opposed a decision while still making that decision for the good of the project. He could be intensely focused on technical details one moment and then step back to consider broader strategic questions the next. This ability to shift between scales, from microscopic physics to geopolitical strategy, was rare and invaluable. People who worked with Oppenheimer often described him in almost paradoxical terms. Cold but empathetic, demanding but supportive, intellectual but practical. These contradictions were not flaws. They were what allowed him to navigate the impossible position he was in. He had to serve multiple masters: the military officials who funded the project, the scientists who did the work, his own conscience. Balancing these demands required flexibility and a kind of tragic awareness that perfection was impossible. Oppenheimer was chosen not because he was perfect, but because he was adaptable. The bomb project needed someone who could live with uncertainty, who could make decisions based on incomplete information, who could adjust as new problems emerged. It needed someone who understood that leadership in this context was not about having all the answers, but about creating an environment where answers could be found. Oppenheimer provided that. He was the node through which information flowed, the person who could hear a problem from an experimentalist in the morning, discuss it with a theorist at lunch, and present options to military officials in the afternoon. His appointment was not without controversy. The security concerns lingered throughout the project. FBI files on Oppenheimer grew thick with reports of his past associations, his friends who were communists, his wife's former husband who had died fighting in Spain on the Republican side. Military intelligence officers questioned whether he could be trusted with the nation's most secret project. Groves defended him repeatedly, arguing that Oppenheimer's contributions were irreplaceable, that his past associations were less important than his current dedication. This tension never fully disappeared. Oppenheimer lived under surveillance, aware that his phone might be tapped, his mail read, his movements tracked. It added another layer of pressure to an already overwhelming job. Yet he accepted it as part of the cost. The work mattered more than his comfort or privacy. He compartmentalized, focusing on what needed to be done rather than dwelling on the invasiveness of security measures. What Oppenheimer understood, perhaps better than anyone else involved, was that the bomb project was as much about coordination as creation. The physics was difficult, yes, but it was ultimately solvable. The real challenge was orchestrating dozens of separate efforts so they converged toward a working weapon. Uranium enrichment, plutonium production, weapon design, testing procedures, all had to proceed in parallel, each depending on the others, none able to wait for complete certainty before moving forward. This required a kind of intellectual agility that was Oppenheimer's particular gift. He could hold the entire project in his mind, understanding how pieces fit together, seeing bottlenecks before they became critical, redirecting resources when one approach stalled. He worked long hours, often late into the night, reading reports, discussing problems, making decisions. His health suffered. He lost weight. He smoked constantly. The work consumed him, but he never wavered. Oppenheimer also served as translator between worlds. He could explain technical concepts to military officers in ways that made sense without being condescending. He could communicate military urgency to scientists without making it sound like arbitrary pressure. He bridged cultures, academic and military, that often misunderstood each other. This bridging was exhausting, requiring constant adjustment of language and emphasis, but it was necessary. The project could not succeed if its two halves could not communicate effectively. There were moments when Oppenheimer's leadership was tested severely. Disagreements between scientists over approaches. Personality conflicts. Times when morale sagged because progress seemed impossible. In these moments, Oppenheimer's response was usually the same. Listen, acknowledge the difficulty, then refocus on the goal. He did not pretend problems did not exist. He did not minimize frustration. But he also did not allow despair to take root. There was work to be done. They would find a way. His management style was unusual for military projects. He allowed arguments to continue until they reached resolution through evidence rather than authority. He encouraged dissent as long as it was constructive. He protected scientists from interference, running interference with military bureaucracy so they could focus on research. This created loyalty. People worked harder for Oppenheimer not because they feared him, but because they respected him and believed he respected them. Yet Oppenheimer was not soft. When someone was not contributing, he removed them. When an approach was clearly failing, he shut it down. He could be cutting in criticism when he felt someone was wasting time or resources. His standards were high, and he expected people to meet them. The combination of support and demand created an environment where excellence was expected and usually achieved. Oppenheimer's selection as scientific director was a gamble that paid off, though not without cost. He gave the project coherence and direction. He turned what could have been a chaotic collection of competing efforts into a unified program. But the experience changed him. The man who emerged from Los Alamos in 1945 was different from the one who had arrived in 1943. More haunted, more aware of complexity, more burdened by what he had helped create. In retrospect, it is hard to imagine anyone else successfully leading the project. Oppenheimer's specific combination of brilliance, humility, determination, and tragic awareness was exactly what was needed. Someone more confident might have made catastrophic decisions. Someone less driven might have allowed the project to drift. Someone without his ability to understand both science and human nature might have created an environment where brilliant people could not work together effectively. Oppenheimer was not perfect, but he was suited to the moment in ways that became clear only as the project unfolded. The choice of Oppenheimer mattered because leadership at this level is not just about technical competence. It is about vision, about holding together disparate efforts through force of personality and clarity of purpose. Oppenheimer provided that. He was the project's intellectual and moral center, the person who carried the weight of what they were doing and somehow kept moving forward despite it. His selection was one of the most consequential personnel decisions of the war, though it would not be recognized as such until much later. The project needed a name, something bureaucratically bland that would not attract attention. In August 1942, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officially designated the effort as the Manhattan Engineer District, or simply the Manhattan Project. The name was deliberately misleading. The work would not take place primarily in Manhattan. The offices were there initially, which gave the project its designation, but the real work would happen in remote locations far from cities, far from curious eyes. This naming reflected a broader strategy: hide the project in plain sight through bureaucratic camouflage. It would have paperwork, budgets, and organizational charts like any military engineering project. It would have a district number and filing codes. But the substance would remain secret. People outside the project would see references to Manhattan District and assume it involved construction or logistics, something mundane and forgettable. The secrecy was layered and comprehensive. Security measures were not just about preventing spies from learning details. They were about preventing most of the people working on the project from understanding what they were building. This approach, called compartmentalization, meant that each person or group would know only what they needed to know for their specific task. A technician operating an enrichment machine would not know what the enriched uranium would be used for. A construction worker building facilities at Hanford would not know what those facilities would produce. Even scientists working on related problems might not know how their work connected to the larger goal. Compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It limited how much information any single person could compromise if captured or if they talked carelessly. It also made it difficult for anyone to piece together the full picture even if they were determined to do so. The Manhattan Project was like a jigsaw puzzle deliberately kept in separate boxes, with most participants holding just a few pieces and no image of what the completed puzzle should look like. This approach created strange dynamics. People worked alongside each other for years without being able to discuss what they were doing. Conversations were carefully monitored. Mail was censored. Phone calls were listened to. Workers were told to avoid asking questions, to focus on their assigned tasks, to not speculate about the purpose of their work. The social fabric of normal workplace interaction was deliberately frayed. For scientists, this was particularly difficult. Science depends on open communication, on sharing findings, on collaborative problem-solving. Compartmentalization ran counter to every instinct they had developed. A physicist working on one aspect of weapon design could not easily consult with a colleague working on a related problem unless both had clearance for both areas. This slowed progress and created frustration. Many scientists chafed under the restrictions, feeling that secrecy was hindering the work it was meant to protect. Oppenheimer pushed back against excessive compartmentalization where he could, arguing that scientists needed to understand context to work effectively. He wanted people at Los Alamos to have a broader view than their immediate tasks. This created tension with security officials who wanted maximum separation of information. Oppenheimer usually won these arguments, but not without struggle. His position was that you could not ask brilliant people to solve unprecedented problems while keeping them ignorant of what they were solving for. The compartmentalization extended to geography. The project was dispersed across multiple sites, each focused on a different challenge. Oak Ridge in Tennessee handled uranium enrichment. Hanford in Washington produced plutonium. Los Alamos in New Mexico designed the weapon itself. Supporting facilities existed elsewhere, working on specific components or processes. Each site operated semi-independently, reporting up through bureaucratic channels but not communicating laterally with other sites except through authorized contacts. This dispersion was partly about security, making it harder to destroy the entire project with a single attack or act of sabotage. But it was also about practical necessity. The processes involved required enormous amounts of electricity, water, and space. Enriching uranium needed huge facilities. Producing plutonium needed nuclear reactors, which needed cooling water from rivers. Designing and testing weapon components needed isolation from populated areas. No single location could accommodate everything. Several methods were pursued simultaneously because no one knew which would work best. The urgency meant that waiting to choose the optimal method was not acceptable. Instead, multiple approaches proceeded in parallel. If one failed, others might succeed. If several worked, the results could be combined. This redundancy was expensive but pragmatic given the stakes. Electromagnetic separation was one method. It worked like a mass spectrometer, a device physicists used to measure atomic masses. Uranium was vaporized and ionized, then accelerated through a magnetic field. The lighter uranium-235 ions curved slightly more than the heavier uranium-238 ions. Collectors at the end of the curved path caught the separated isotopes. The concept was simple. The implementation was not. Scaling electromagnetic separation to industrial levels required building machines called calatrons, large circular devices with powerful magnets. The magnets needed to be precisely shaped and enormously powerful, consuming massive amounts of electricity. The entire apparatus had to be kept under high vacuum so ions could travel without hitting air molecules. Maintaining vacuum in such large spaces was technically challenging. Any leak meant the machine stopped working. The calatrons were arranged in racetracks, large oval configurations housing multiple separators. At Oak Ridge, hundreds of calatrons operated simultaneously. The scale was staggering. The magnets required copper coils, but copper was scarce during wartime. The project borrowed thousands of tons of silver from the US Treasury to wind coils instead. Silver is a better conductor than copper, though far more valuable. After the war, the silver was returned, in detail that highlights the project's extraordinary access to resources. Operating calatrons required patience. Each machine processed tiny amounts of uranium. After a run, the collected material was recovered, refined, and fed through again. Enrichment happened in stages, each stage increasing the concentration of uranium-235 slightly. Material would pass through alpha stages, reaching perhaps 10 or 20% uranium-235, then through beta stages, reaching 80 or 90%. The process was slow, measured in months, not days. Grams accumulated into kilograms over countless repetitions. Human operators, mostly women with no scientific training, ran the calatrons. They were taught to monitor dials and adjust controls to keep the beams stable. The work required attention and consistency but not understanding. They did not know they were separating uranium isotopes. They knew only that certain readings should stay within certain ranges, and they adjusted knobs to maintain those ranges. Their precision and dedication directly affected how much enriched uranium was produced. Gaseous diffusion was another enrichment method, based on a different physical principle. If uranium is converted into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and then forced through a porous barrier, the lighter molecules diffuse through slightly faster. The effect is small. After one barrier, the gas is only slightly enriched. But if you repeat the process thousands of times, the enrichment accumulates. The K-25 plant built for gaseous diffusion was a monument to this approach. It contained thousands of diffusion stages arranged in a cascade, each stage taking the output from the previous one and enriching it a bit more. The barriers had to be precisely made, with billions of microscopic holes. The uranium hexafluoride gas was corrosive, attacking most materials. Finding materials that could withstand it while maintaining their pore structure was a major challenge. The plant required compressors to push gas through each stage, cooling systems to remove heat generated by compression, and vast piping networks connecting everything. The complexity was overwhelming. Early operations were plagued by leaks, equipment failures, and inefficiencies. Technicians worked constantly to maintain and improve the system. Gradually, through trial and error, the plant became more reliable. Enriched uranium began flowing, slowly but steadily. A third method, thermal diffusion, was also used briefly. It exploited the tendency of lighter molecules to concentrate in warmer regions of a temperature gradient. Columns with hot surfaces on one side and cold on the other could produce slight enrichment. Many columns operating in parallel could generate useful amounts of partially enriched uranium. Though less efficient than other methods, thermal diffusion plants were quicker to build and could pre-enrich uranium before it entered gaseous diffusion or electromagnetic separation, improving overall efficiency. All these methods shared a common characteristic. They required enormous energy input for tiny gains. Separating isotopes is fundamentally difficult because the difference you are exploiting is so small. Every method involved running processes thousands or millions of times to achieve significant enrichment. This repetition consumed electricity, materials, labor, and time. The energy cost of enriching uranium was staggering, which is why the project needed access to massive electrical generation capacity. The work was also cumulative. Small amounts of enriched uranium from different methods could be combined, blended to achieve desired concentrations. Material that had gone through electromagnetic separation might be fed into gaseous diffusion for further enrichment. Nothing was wasted. Every gram of uranium-235 was precious, representing countless hours of machine operation and human oversight. Progress was measured carefully. Samples were tested to determine enrichment levels. If material was not enriched enough, it went through additional processing. If machinery was not performing well, it was adjusted or repaired. The process was iterative, constantly refined based on results. Engineers learned as they went, improving efficiency, reducing downtime, troubleshooting failures. There was no manual for industrial uranium enrichment. It was being invented in real time. Operating the reactors continuously produced heat, radioactivity, and plutonium, but extracting the plutonium was its own monumental challenge. After uranium fuel had been irradiated in the reactor for weeks or months, it contained small amounts of plutonium mixed with uranium and dozens of highly radioactive fission products. The fuel slugs had to be removed from the reactor, transported to chemical processing facilities, and dissolved in acids. Then, through carefully designed chemical procedures, the plutonium had to be separated from everything else. The problem was that everything involved was intensely radioactive. Workers could not approach the fuel directly without receiving lethal radiation doses within minutes. Every operation had to be performed remotely. The chemical separation buildings at Hanford were massive concrete structures, their thick walls providing radiation shielding. Inside, workers used mechanical manipulators and periscopes to operate equipment they could not touch or even see directly except through heavily shielded viewing windows. The process was painstaking. Irradiated fuel slugs were pushed out of the reactor into water-filled pools where they cooled, both thermally and radioactively, for weeks. The water absorbed radiation and provided shielding. After cooling, the slugs were transferred to dissolver tanks where they were chemically dissolved. The resulting solution was processed through a series of precipitation and extraction steps, each one separating plutonium from unwanted materials. Every step had to work reliably despite being conducted remotely with equipment that could not be easily repaired. Pumps failed. Valves stuck. Instruments gave incorrect readings. When something went wrong, diagnosis and repair were complicated by the fact that the equipment was radioactive and inaccessible. Sometimes entire process cells had to be abandoned because they were too contaminated to service. New cells were brought online while contaminated ones remained sealed, too dangerous to enter. The waste from plutonium separation was staggeringly radioactive. Millions of gallons of liquid waste containing fission products were stored in underground tanks, a temporary solution with long-term consequences no one fully considered at the time. The urgency of producing plutonium for bombs took priority over waste management. Tanks were built, waste was pumped in, and the problem of what to do with it permanently was left for later. This created a legacy of contamination at Hanford that persists more than 70 years later. Despite these challenges, plutonium was produced. Slowly, gram by gram, it accumulated. Each gram represented weeks of reactor operation and complex chemical processing. The material was shipped to Los Alamos in heavily shielded containers, arriving as small metallic buttons barely larger than coins. These unprepossessing pieces of metal contain the potential for enormous destruction, but to look at them, you would never know. Plutonium is a silvery metal, not particularly distinctive except for being slightly warm to the touch from its radioactive decay. At Los Alamos, scientists working with plutonium encountered unexpected properties. The metal had multiple crystalline forms, changing density and volume depending on temperature. It was difficult to machine, tending to crumble or oxidize. It was also toxic, both chemically like a heavy metal and radioactively. Handling it required extreme care, working in glove boxes with filtered air, taking precautions against ingestion or inhalation. Small amounts could deliver lethal doses of radiation if they entered the body. The strange behavior of plutonium metal created problems for weapon design. A bomb design that worked for uranium might not work for plutonium because the materials behaved differently. This became critical in early 1944 when enough plutonium had been produced to run tests. Scientists discovered that reactor-produced plutonium contained not just plutonium-239 but also a small amount of plutonium-240, an isotope with different nuclear properties. Plutonium-240 undergoes spontaneous fission, meaning its nuclei split occasionally without being struck by a neutron. This created a serious problem. In the gun-type weapon design planned for uranium, two pieces of fissile material were slammed together to create critical mass. This worked for uranium-235 because it was relatively stable. But with plutonium-240 present, spontaneous fissions would occur as soon as the pieces came close together, starting the chain reaction before the assembly was complete. The result would be a weak fizzle rather than a full explosion. The gun design, simple and reliable for uranium, would not work for plutonium. This discovery, arriving relatively late in the project, created a crisis. Enormous resources had gone into producing plutonium. If it could not be used in a weapon, years of work and billions of dollars would be wasted. The solution required inventing an entirely different weapon design, one that could assemble plutonium into critical mass faster than the gun method allowed. This faster assembly would need to happen in microseconds, too quickly for spontaneous fissions to pre-detonate the weapon. The alternative was implosion. Instead of shooting one piece of plutonium into another, the idea was to start with a subcritical sphere and compress it rapidly by surrounding it with chemical explosives. When detonated, the explosives would create an inward-moving shock wave, compressing the plutonium sphere to higher density. At higher density, the same mass of plutonium would be supercritical, and the chain reaction would proceed to completion before the material could fly apart. Implosion was conceptually elegant but practically difficult. The compression had to be extremely symmetrical. If one side compressed more than another, the plutonium would squirt out the weaker side rather than compress uniformly. Achieving this symmetry required designing explosive lenses, shaped charges that would focus the blast inward evenly from all directions. It required fast electronics to detonate dozens of individual explosive charges simultaneously, with timing precision measured in millionths of a second. It required understanding how materials behaved under enormous pressures and shock waves, physics that was not well studied before the project. Much of the work at Los Alamos from 1944 onward focused on implosion. Experiments tested explosive configurations. High-speed photography captured the behavior of shock waves. Theoretical calculations predicted compression dynamics. Practical engineering solved problems like triggering multiple detonators simultaneously and shaping explosive charges to produce the desired implosion geometry. The work was interdisciplinary, requiring expertise in explosives, metallurgy, hydrodynamics, electronics, and nuclear physics. The plutonium problem demonstrated how the bomb project constantly encountered unexpected challenges. Initial assumptions proved wrong. Elegant solutions became impossible. The path forward required invention under pressure. There was no time to publish papers and wait for peer review. Problems were solved through rapid iteration, testing ideas quickly and discarding those that did not work. The usual deliberate pace of science was compressed into months or weeks. Decisions with billion-dollar consequences were made based on incomplete information because waiting for certainty was not an option. For the scientists involved, this was both exhilarating and exhausting. They were solving problems at the frontier of knowledge, pushing into areas where no one had gone before. But they were doing it under intense time pressure, with the weight of the war hanging over every decision. Mistakes could be catastrophic, not just scientifically but strategically. If the weapon did not work, if the project failed, the war might be lost or prolonged with enormous additional casualties. That pressure never lifted. The plutonium path to the bomb, which had seemed like a parallel approach to uranium enrichment, ended up being harder and more uncertain. Yet it also pushed the project toward more sophisticated weapon designs. The implosion method, developed out of necessity for plutonium, was more efficient than the gun design. It used fissile material more completely, required less of it, and produced a larger explosion for the same amount of fuel. The crisis created by plutonium's spontaneous fission ultimately led to a better weapon, though at significant cost in time and resources. By early 1945, the Hanford reactors were producing plutonium steadily. The chemical separation plants were operating, though not without constant difficulties. Plutonium was accumulating at Los Alamos. But whether it could be turned into a working weapon remained an open question. The implosion design was unproven. It would work in theory, but theory had been wrong before. Until implosion was tested with actual nuclear material, no one could be certain. The plutonium problem had been solved on paper, but paper solutions are not weapons. The real test was still to come. Designing a weapon that had never existed required thinking through problems that had never been encountered. How do you make something explode when the physics operates on time scales too fast for human perception? How do you compress a metal sphere uniformly from all directions? How do you ensure that neutrons initiate the chain reaction at the right microsecond? Every aspect required invention. Every component needed testing. And everything had to work perfectly the first time because there would be no second chances. The gun type designed for uranium was relatively straightforward. It resembled an artillery piece, though with unusual projectile and target. A subcritical piece of uranium, called the bullet, would be fired down a gun barrel into another subcritical piece, called the target. When combined, the total mass would exceed critical mass. Neutrons from spontaneous fission or added from a neutron initiator would start the chain reaction. The design's main advantage was simplicity and reliability. Gun assemblies were well understood. If the bullet reached the target, the bomb would work. The challenge was speed. The uranium pieces had to come together fast enough that the chain reaction completed before the explosion blew the weapon apart. Once the chain reaction started, energy release caused temperatures to spike into millions of degrees. At those temperatures, materials vaporize and expand explosively. This expansion would disassemble the critical mass within microseconds, stopping the chain reaction. For a powerful explosion, you needed the chain reaction to proceed through many generations before disassembly occurred. This required fast assembly and immediate initiation. The gun barrel had to be strong enough to withstand firing without rupturing, but not so heavy that the weapon became undeliverable. The bullet had to be accelerated to high speed quickly. The target had to be positioned precisely. All of this was engineering, difficult engineering, but nothing fundamentally impossible. Los Alamos scientists were confident the gun design would work for uranium. It was so reliable that they decided not to test it. The first use would be in combat. Implosion was far more complex. The concept required surrounding a sphere of plutonium with carefully shaped explosive charges. When detonated simultaneously, these charges would send shock waves inward. The shock waves would compress the plutonium sphere, increasing its density. At higher density, neutrons had less distance to travel between nuclei, making a chain reaction more likely. A subcritical mass at normal density could become supercritical when compressed. The difficulty was symmetry. If the implosion was not perfectly spherical, The plutonium would deform rather than compress uniformly. High-speed X-ray images showed what happened in asymmetric implosions. The core squirted out the sides like a seed squeezed between fingers. This was useless for a weapon. Perfect spherical compression required explosive lenses, shaped charges designed to turn the chaotic blast of chemical explosives into a smooth, converging shock wave. Creating explosive lenses required understanding how shock waves moved through different materials. Fast explosives detonated at several kilometers per second. Slow explosives detonated at a few kilometers per second. By shaping explosives so shock waves refracted at interfaces between fast and slow materials, engineers could focus the blast. It was like designing an optical lens, but for explosions rather than light. The mathematics was similar, but the testing was dramatically different. You could not simply look through an explosive lens to see if it worked. You had to detonate it and measure the results. Testing implosion designs became a constant activity at Los Alamos. Explosives were detonated, sometimes multiple times per day. High-speed cameras captured the implosions. X-ray flashes timed to coincide with peak compression photographed the imploding core. Gradually, through hundreds of tests, the design improved. Asymmetries were identified and corrected. Explosive configurations were refined. The margin between success and failure was measured in microseconds and millimeters. The core of the implosion weapon was a sphere of plutonium surrounded by a neutron reflector, a shell of material that bounced escaping neutrons back into the core. This reflector reduced the amount of plutonium needed for criticality. Inside the plutonium sphere was a hollow cavity, the center of which contained an initiator, a device that would produce a burst of neutrons at the moment of maximum compression. The initiator's timing was critical. If it fired too early or too late, the explosion would be weaker. The initiator design was itself an engineering challenge. It needed to produce neutrons reliably, on demand, at the precise moment of compression. The solution was a device called an urchin, a sphere with protruding spikes, made from materials that produced neutrons when mixed. Before implosion, the materials were kept separate. The shock wave of implosion crushed the initiator, mixing the materials and triggering neutron emission. The design was clever, relying on the implosion itself to activate the neutron source at exactly the right moment. Triggering the implosion required detonating dozens of explosive charges simultaneously. The timing precision needed was extraordinary. If one charge fired even a few microseconds before another, the resulting asymmetry would ruin the implosion. This required electronic detonators far more precise than anything used in conventional weapons. It also required a firing system that could send electrical signals to all detonators at once, compensating for small differences in wire length or electrical resistance. The Ordnance Division at Los Alamos developed these systems through meticulous testing. Circuits were designed and tested. Detonators were evaluated for reliability and consistency. Firing units were assembled and calibrated. Every component needed to work perfectly because the entire weapon's success depended on everything happening within a window measured in millionths of a second. This was engineering at a level of precision that seemed almost absurd. Yet it was necessary. As the design evolved, weight became a concern. The weapon had to be deliverable by aircraft, which meant it could not be too heavy. Every component was examined for weight reduction without compromising function. Explosives were chosen partly for their power-to-weight ratio. Structural elements were made as light as possible. The final design was still extremely heavy, several tons, but it could be carried by the modified B-29 bombers designated to deliver it. Safety was another consideration. The weapon had to be safe to transport, handle, and load into an aircraft, but ready to detonate when triggered. This required multiple safety interlocks. The weapon was assembled in stages, with critical components inserted late in the process. The firing circuits had plugs that were only connected shortly before the mission. These measures ensured that an accident during handling could not cause a nuclear explosion, though they could not eliminate all risks. The physicists and engineers designing the weapon lived with constant uncertainty. Their calculations suggested it would work, but calculations were not certainty. Small errors or overlooked factors could cause failure. The pressure was immense. Careers, reputations, and potentially the outcome of the war rested on whether this untested design would function as predicted. There was no established body of knowledge to rely on. They were the first people in history to design such a weapon. Every decision was a choice made with incomplete information. Meetings were frequent, sometimes daily, where progress was reviewed and problems discussed. Arguments were common, not from personal animosity but from genuine disagreement about technical approaches. Oppenheimer managed these debates, allowing them to continue until evidence pointed toward a resolution. His ability to let discussions proceed without forcing premature consensus was crucial. The best ideas emerged from clash and refinement, not from diktat. The theoretical division, led by Hans Bethe, performed calculations constantly. How fast would the chain reaction proceed? How much energy would be released? What would happen to the weapon casing? How would the explosion propagate through the atmosphere? These questions required solving equations that had no simple solutions. Approximations were made, checked against experiments when possible, refined when new data became available. Theoretical work and experimental work informed each other in an ongoing dialogue. Women at Los Alamos, often wives of scientists or recruited specifically, performed much of the computational work. They operated mechanical calculators for hours, working through equations by hand. These human computers, as they were called, were essential to the project's progress. Without their patient, meticulous work, the calculations needed to design the weapon would have taken far longer. Their contributions were often overlooked later, but they were critical at the time. As 1945 progressed, the weapon designs solidified. The uranium gun design, nicknamed Little Boy, was essentially complete. It waited only for enough enriched uranium to be delivered. The plutonium implosion design, nicknamed Fat Man because of its bulbous shape, was nearly ready but still unproven. Los Alamos scientists knew they needed a test. They needed to detonate an implosion device with real nuclear material to confirm it would work. Without a test, there was too much uncertainty. The decision was made: there would be a test in the New Mexico desert. It would be called Trinity. Life inside Los Alamos was unlike any other wartime experience. Scientists lived and worked behind fences, their location unacknowledged, their work unnamed. Mail was censored. Travel required permission. Conversations had to be guarded even among colleagues because compartmentalization meant not everyone had clearance for every topic. Yet within these constraints, a community formed, one with its own culture, rhythms, and character. Housing was basic. Early arrivals lived in converted ranch school buildings, rustic and poorly heated. As more people arrived, quickly constructed apartment buildings appeared, simple wooden structures arranged in rows. They were cramped, thin-walled, and minimally furnished. Privacy was limited. Neighbors heard each other's conversations and arguments. Yet people made homes. They decorated as best they could with what was available. They created routines, celebrated birthdays, observed holidays. Families with children faced particular challenges. The schools had to be created from nothing, staffed by whoever had teaching experience or was willing to try. Textbooks and supplies were limited. Yet children attended classes, made friends, played in the surrounding landscape. For many, Los Alamos was simply home, the strange circumstances invisible to them because they knew nothing else. They grew up not knowing exactly where they lived or what their parents did. Social life developed organically. People gathered for parties, dances, hikes into the mountains. Music was important. Chamber groups formed, playing concerts in makeshift venues. There were lectures on topics unrelated to the project, opportunities to think about something other than bomb design. These gatherings were necessary relief, moments when the pressure could be set aside temporarily. The community was unusual in its composition. Scientists from multiple countries, refugees from fascism, Americans from various backgrounds, all lived together. Political views ranged widely. Some were leftists who had supported progressive causes. Others were conservative or apolitical. Normally these differences might have created conflict, but the shared purpose and isolation created bonds. Arguments happened, but rarely escalated into lasting animosity. There was too much work to do and too much dependence on each other. Women's roles at Los Alamos were complex. Many were scientists or technicians in their own right, making direct contributions to the technical work. Others were wives who had given up their own careers to follow husbands to the mesa. They often found themselves underemployed, their talents not fully utilized by an organization that sometimes struggled to see beyond traditional gender roles. Frustration and boredom were common, though many found ways to contribute through teaching, nursing, or administrative work. Security measures created constant friction. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Everyone needed badges to move between areas. Scientists chafed at restrictions that seemed arbitrary or excessive. Oppenheimer argued repeatedly with security officials over what information could be shared and with whom. The balance between security and scientific efficiency was never perfect. It was a constant negotiation, with security officials trying to minimize information flow and scientists arguing they needed broader knowledge to work effectively. Despite restrictions, information leaked through informal networks. Scientists talked during lunch, after hours, on hikes. Bits of knowledge from different areas combined in conversations that were technically violations of compartmentalization but often led to useful insights. Oppenheimer tacitly encouraged this, believing that excessive secrecy hindered progress more than it helped security. This created tension with military authorities, but Oppenheimer usually prevailed because his position was difficult to challenge without replacing him, which no one wanted to do. The isolation of Los Alamos meant that entertainment had to be self-generated. Movie nights showed films that arrived weeks after their release in cities. The single canteen served as social center, gathering place, and venue for informal meetings. Sports leagues formed. People hiked in the surrounding mountains, exploring canyons and peaks. The landscape was beautiful, which helped. Even under pressure, the setting provided moments of peace. Not everyone adapted well. Some people struggled with isolation, with secrecy, with the weight of what they were building. Depression was not uncommon. Marriage stress increased under the unnatural circumstances. There were few outlets for tension. No one could talk with outsiders about their frustrations because explaining would require revealing what they were doing. This created a kind of pressure cooker environment where problems had no external release. Alcohol consumption was high. Parties often involved heavy drinking, a way to cope with stress. Some people developed drinking problems that would persist after the war. The project did not officially acknowledge these issues, focusing instead on productivity. Mental health was not yet a recognized concern in the way it would be later. People were expected to endure. Oppenheimer himself was everywhere. He attended meetings, visited laboratories, dropped in on experiments. He knew what was happening in different divisions. Scientists would see him walking the grounds late at night, smoking, thinking. He was physically present in a way that made people feel connected to the project's leadership. This visibility was important for morale. It showed that the director was not distant or detached but engaged with the work at every level. Yet Oppenheimer also carried a personal burden that was visible to those close to him. He lost weight throughout the project, his already thin frame becoming gaunt. He smoked incessantly. He seemed to carry the weight of the project physically, his body reflecting the stress his mind endured. Friends worried about him, but he did not slow down. There was no time for rest. The work continued 7 days a week, holidays included. The passage of time at Los Alamos was marked not by seasons but by milestones. When enough plutonium arrived for the first tests. When implosion experiments began showing consistent results. When enriched uranium shipments from Oak Ridge accelerated. When the decision came to schedule Trinity. These markers gave structure to the days and weeks that otherwise blurred together in endless work. Children at Los Alamos grew up with strange normalcy. They had friends, attended school, played games. But they also lived behind fences, saw armed guards, heard parents speak in careful phrases that avoided details. Years later, many would recall Los Alamos as a happy childhood despite its strangeness. They remembered community, adventure, the freedom to explore wild landscape. The darker purpose underlying everything was invisible to them until much later. For the adults, the dual nature of life was inescapable. They were building a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. They were also living ordinary lives, raising families, forming friendships, experiencing moments of joy and frustration like anyone else. These two realities coexisted uneasily. Conversations at dinner parties avoided the topic everyone was thinking about. Humor became a way to cope, jokes that were simultaneously dark and necessary. As the project neared completion, the atmosphere changed. Excitement mixed with dread. They were close to achieving what they had set out to do, but what they were achieving was the ability to destroy cities instantly. Some scientists began having second thoughts, questioning whether they should have started this work. Others focused on finishing, believing that stopping now would waste everything they had sacrificed. The moral questions that had been deferred in the urgency of work began surfacing. Compartmentalization extended even to families. Spouses often did not know exactly what their partners were working on. Children certainly did not. This created distance within relationships, secrets that could not be shared even with those closest. Some marriages strengthened under the pressure, couples supporting each other without needing full disclosure. Others strained, the enforced distance eroding intimacy. The community that formed at Los Alamos was temporary by design, yet the bonds formed there would last lifetimes. People who worked together under such intense circumstances developed connections that persisted long after the project ended. Reunions decades later would bring together individuals who shared experiences no one else could fully understand. They had lived through something extraordinary and isolating, something that marked them permanently. But in the moment, in the daily reality of life behind the fences, it often felt mundane. Work, meals, sleep, repeat. The extraordinary became routine. The unprecedented became familiar. They were designing weapons that would reshape history, but day to day, they were just doing their jobs, solving problems, attending meetings, trying to make progress on whatever they were assigned. The historic significance was distant, abstract. The work was immediate and concrete. This ordinariness within extraordinary circumstances was perhaps the strangest aspect of Los Alamos. People adapted to conditions that should have felt surreal. They normalized secrecy, isolation, the presence of armed guards, the knowledge that they were working on something that could kill hundreds of thousands. Humans adapt, and the Los Alamos residents were no exception. They made lives within the constraints, finding ways to be human despite the inhuman scale of what they were collectively creating. By spring of 1945, the weapon designs were solid enough that attention turned to testing. The uranium gun design, little boy, would not be tested. Scientists were confident enough in its simplicity and reliability. The enriched uranium was too scarce to waste on a test when it could be used in an actual weapon. But the plutonium implosion design, Fat Man, required testing. It was too complex, too unproven, too dependent on precise timing and symmetry. Without a test, they could not be certain it would work. The test site needed to be remote, flat, and relatively close to Los Alamos. After surveying several locations, a stretch of desert in southern New Mexico was selected. The site was part of the Alamogordo bombing range, already military land, sparsely populated and desolate. The location was called Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man, named by Spanish travelers centuries before. The name seemed fitting for what was about to happen there. The test was codenamed Trinity. Oppenheimer chose the name, taking it from a John Donne poem, though he never fully explained his choice. The name stuck. Trinity would be the first test of a nuclear weapon, the first time humanity would deliberately create a nuclear explosion. The test carried enormous implications. If it succeeded, the Manhattan Project would have produced a working bomb. If it failed, years of work and billions of dollars would be called into question. Preparations began months in advance. A tower was constructed to hold the bomb. It was 100 feet tall, steel framework, strong enough to support several tons. The bomb would be assembled at the top and detonated in the air to simulate an actual combat drop. Instruments to measure the explosion were set up at various distances. Cameras, radiation detectors, pressure gauges, all positioned to capture data. The instrumentation was extensive because this was not just a demonstration but a scientific experiment. Every aspect of the explosion needed to be measured and understood. Bunkers were built at different distances for observers. These were concrete structures partially buried in the ground, with thick walls facing the tower. Scientists would watch from these bunkers, protected from the blast and radiation. Even so, they were advised not to look directly at the flash. They were given welder's glass to protect their eyes from the intense light that calculations predicted. The bomb itself, the gadget as it was called, was assembled carefully in the days before the test. Plutonium components were brought from Los Alamos. The explosive lenses were checked and rechecked. The initiator was prepared. Every connection was tested multiple times. The assembly process was meticulous, each step documented, each component verified. There was no room for error. A mistake in assembly could cause the test to fail or, worse, create a hazardous situation during preparation. As the test date approached, tensions rose. Weather became a critical concern. The test required relatively calm conditions. High winds or rain would disperse radioactive fallout unpredictably, potentially contaminating areas beyond the bombing range. Meteorologists provided forecasts, but weather in the desert was notoriously variable. The test was scheduled for July 16, 1945, but the exact timing would depend on conditions. Scientists debated what would happen. Most believed the implosion would work, but how powerful would the explosion be? Estimates ranged widely, from a few hundred tons of TNT equivalent to tens of thousands. Some worried about more exotic possibilities. Could the explosion ignite the atmosphere, creating a runaway fusion reaction? Calculations said no, but the uncertainty was unsettling. They were doing something never done before. Confidence was not the same as certainty. The days before Trinity were tense at Los Alamos. Scientists who would observe the test prepared to travel to the site. Others waited at Los Alamos, knowing that their years of work would be validated or invalidated in a single moment. Conversations were subdued. People went through motions, but focus was on the coming test. History was about to judge their efforts. At the test site, final preparations continued. The gadget was hoisted to the top of the tower and secured. Electrical connections were made between the bomb and the firing circuits in the control bunker thousands of feet away. Test sequences were run to verify that signals reached all detonators. Everything checked out. The weapon was ready. Now it was a matter of waiting for acceptable weather. July 15th brought rain and wind to the test site. The test was delayed. Oppenheimer and General Groves, who had traveled to the site, conferred with meteorologists. The forecast suggested conditions might improve in the early morning hours of July 16th. The decision was made to attempt the test at 5:30 a.m. if the weather allowed. Through the night, scientists waited, watching the sky, hoping the storms would pass. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 16th, the weather improved slightly. It was not ideal, but it was acceptable. The decision was made to proceed. Final checks were conducted. Observers moved to their bunkers. A few scientists placed bets on the yield, gallows humor masking anxiety. Fermi wondered whether the blast would blow away the atmosphere, a joke that was not entirely a joke. Everyone understood they were about to witness something unprecedented. The countdown began. At bunkers miles from ground zero, scientists lay on the ground, facing away from the tower as they had been instructed. They would wait for the flash, then turn to observe the explosion. The countdown reached its final seconds. Time seemed to slow. Years of work, thousands of people's efforts, billions of dollars, all converging on this single moment in the desert before dawn. At exactly 5:29 and 45 seconds a.m., the firing signal was sent. Electrical current raced through cables to the tower, reaching the detonators simultaneously. The detonators fired, setting off the explosive lenses. Shock waves converged on the plutonium core, compressing it to supercriticality. The initiator crushed, releasing neutrons. The chain reaction began, each generation of fissions doubling the neutron population in a fraction of a microsecond. Within a millionth of a second, billions of nuclei had split, releasing energy equal to thousands of tons of TNT. The light came first, before sound, before heat. A flash brighter than the sun, brighter than anything witnesses had ever seen, bright enough to be visible hundreds of miles away. The desert was illuminated as if by daylight, shadows appearing sharp and stark in the pre-dawn darkness. Scientists saw the flash through closed eyelids, bones visible in their hands as they shielded their faces. Then the fireball. A sphere of incandescent gas expanding outward, orange and yellow and white, roiling with heat. It grew rapidly, reaching several hundred feet in diameter, then rising on a column of superheated air. The heat was intense enough to melt sand into glass for hundreds of feet around ground zero. The tower vaporized instantly, steel turning to gas, leaving no trace. The shock wave followed, a wall of compressed air moving outward at supersonic speed. When it reached the observers' bunkers, it rattled walls and shook the ground. The sound came after, a deep rumbling roar that rolled across the desert, echoing off distant mountains. The noise continued for what seemed like minutes, thunder without end. The fireball continued rising, cooling from white-hot to red as it climbed. It formed the characteristic mushroom shape, a column topped by a spreading cap of cloud. The mushroom rose thousands of feet, higher and higher, carrying with it radioactive debris from the vaporized bomb and earth sucked up by the updraft. It was beautiful in a terrible way, awesome in the original sense of the word. Scientists watching from the bunkers were stunned into silence. They had created this. Their calculations, their experiments, their years of work had culminated in this moment of impossible light and heat. Some felt exhilaration. Some felt horror. Many felt both simultaneously, unable to separate the technical achievement from its implications. Oppenheimer later recalled that a line from Hindu scripture came to his mind, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The words captured something of the moment's weight, the sense that they had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. They had proven that humans could unleash nuclear energy as a weapon. They had demonstrated power beyond anything that had existed before. Measurements from the instruments confirmed what observers suspected. The explosion had yielded approximately 20 kilotons, equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. This was at the higher end of pre-test estimates. It was more than 1,000 times more powerful than any conventional bomb. It was destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. The test site, Ground Zero, was transformed. Where the tower had stood was now a shallow crater. The sand fused into a greenish radioactive glass later called trinitite. Everything within a radius of hundreds of feet was simply gone, vaporized, or carried away in the blast. Further out, equipment was destroyed, instruments blown away or melted. The sheer violence of the explosion exceeded what many had expected. As dawn broke fully, scientists began emerging from bunkers to survey the site from a distance. They wore protective gear and carried dosimeters to measure radiation exposure. The area close to Ground Zero would remain highly radioactive for years. They could not approach it immediately, but from a distance, they could see the transformed landscape, the evidence of what they had created. News of the test's success was communicated to Los Alamos, where people had waited anxiously through the night. Relief and celebration mixed with more complicated emotions. They had succeeded. The weapon worked. But success meant that the bomb would now be used, not in an empty desert but against actual targets. The test's success removed the last barrier to combat use. Trinity was not celebrated publicly. It remained secret, known only to those involved in the project and a few high officials. The Manhattan Project was still classified. The world would not learn of Trinity until after atomic bombs had been used in war. But for those who witnessed it, Trinity was unforgettable. They had seen something no humans had seen before, and they carried that sight with them for the rest of their lives. The success of Trinity answered the question of whether the implosion design worked. It did, spectacularly. The weapon was now no longer theoretical. It was real, tested, proven. This shifted the nature of discussions at Los Alamos and in Washington. The project was complete in the sense that it had achieved its goal, creating working atomic bombs. What remained was deciding how and whether to use them. The immediate reaction among scientists at Los Alamos was complex. There was pride in the technical achievement. They had solved problems that seemed unsolvable. They had designed and built weapons that worked on the first try. This was validation of years of effort. But alongside pride was unease. Trinity made the abstract concrete. They had created something that could destroy a city in seconds. The moral weight, which could be deferred while the outcome was uncertain, now demanded attention. Some scientists began having serious doubts about using the bomb. They had built it to prevent Germany from getting it first, but Germany had surrendered in May 1945, 2 months before Trinity. The original justification no longer applied. Japan was still fighting, but many questioned. For Oppenheimer, the period after Trinity was psychologically difficult. He had led the project successfully. The weapon worked. But now he watched as control passed from scientists to military officers, from laboratory to battlefield. His role diminished. Decisions about targets and timing were made without his input. He had created the tool. Others would wield it. This was as it should be, but it created a sense of displacement. He had lived with total focus on building the bomb. Now that it was built, what was his purpose? The uranium bomb, little boy, was ready first because it did not require testing, and uranium enrichment, though slow, had produced enough material. It was flown to Ithilien in pieces, assembled there under tight security. The weapon was crude by later standards, inefficient in its use of fissile material, but it would work. The gun design was essentially foolproof. When the time came, it would detonate. Weather over Japan became the determining factor for timing. The mission required clear skies for visual targeting. Clouds would obscure the city and make accurate delivery impossible. Meteorologists studied weather patterns, waiting for suitable conditions. Finally, in early August, a window appeared. The mission was scheduled for August 6, 1945. The bomber, Enola Gay, named after the pilot's mother, took off early on the 6th carrying little boy. The flight to Japan was long and uneventful. The crew knew they were carrying something special but still did not understand fully what it would do. As they approached Hiroshima, conditions were clear. The bomb was armed during flight. At 8:15 local time, it was released from 31,000 feet. Little boy fell for 43 seconds. At approximately 1,900 feet above the city, the altitude fuses triggered. The gun fired, shooting the uranium bullet into the target. The chain reaction began and completed in less than a microsecond. The yield was approximately 15 kilotons, slightly less than Trinity but still enormous. The explosion occurred over the center of Hiroshima, a city of over 300,000 people. The blast wave flattened buildings for over a mile in all directions. The heat flash ignited fires across a vast area. People directly exposed to the thermal radiation received lethal burns instantly. Those farther away were killed by collapsing structures or flying debris. The city center was destroyed utterly, reduced to rubble and flame. Fires merged into a firestorm that burned for hours. Thousands died instantly. Thousands more were injured, many mortally, by burns, trauma, and radiation exposure. The crew of the Enola Gay saw the flash and felt the shock wave even at their altitude miles away. They saw the mushroom cloud rising, the city obscured by smoke and dust. They photographed the results and radioed that the mission was successful. Then they flew back to Ithilien, mission accomplished, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had done. At Los Alamos, news of the Hiroshima bombing arrived the same day. The reaction was mixed. There was satisfaction that the weapon had worked as designed. There was relief that perhaps the war would end soon. But there was also dawning horror as initial reports suggested casualties far exceeding what many had imagined. The abstraction had become reality. They had built a weapon, tested it in the desert, and now it had been used against a city full of people. Oppenheimer's reaction was subdued. He gave a brief talk to assembled Los Alamos staff, acknowledging the bombing and suggesting that if people had qualms about continuing weapons work, they should voice them. But he did not express doubt about the decision to use the bomb. He believed it had been necessary. Still, the weight was visible in his demeanor. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by years of pressure and now by the knowledge of Hiroshima. Japan did not surrender immediately. The military leadership was divided. Some wanted to continue fighting. Others recognized that the war was lost but struggled over surrender terms. 3 days after Hiroshima, with no surrender forthcoming, the second bomb was prepared. The target was Kokura, but weather forced the mission to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The Fat Man bomb, the plutonium implosion design identical to the Trinity device, was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. The explosion was similar in yield to Trinity, approximately 20 kilotons, but the city's terrain channeled the blast into valleys, concentrating destruction in some areas while leaving others relatively less damaged. Still, the devastation was immense. Tens of thousands died immediately. The total death toll from both bombs would eventually exceed 200,000 as people succumbed to injuries and radiation sickness in the weeks and months that followed. The double shock of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with Soviet entry into the war against Japan on August 9, finally broke the deadlock in Japanese leadership. On August 15, Japan announced its surrender. World War II was over. The atomic bombs, many believed, had ended the war without the need for an invasion that could have caused even higher casualties on both sides. At Los Alamos, the war's end brought celebration but also complicated emotions. They had succeeded. The project had achieved its goal. The weapon had worked and had apparently shortened the war. But the price was visible in photographs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in reports of destruction and suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. The scientists had built the bombs, but they had not been in the aircraft or made the targeting decisions. They were responsible but not directly culpable. This distinction was important psychologically, though it did not eliminate the weight. The immediate aftermath was chaos. With the war over, what was the purpose of Los Alamos? Would the project continue? Would atomic weapons production become permanent? What about international control of atomic energy? These questions had no immediate answers. Scientists began leaving Los Alamos, returning to universities and interrupted careers. Some remained, continuing weapons work. Others left and never returned, wanting distance from what they had done. Oppenheimer stayed initially, helping with the transition but increasingly looking toward departure. He had led the project successfully. He had delivered what was asked. But the experience had changed him fundamentally. The man who left Los Alamos was not the same as the one who had arrived in 1943. He was more famous, more influential, but also more burdened. The rest of his life would be shaped by his role in creating atomic weapons. The scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project faced a common dilemma afterward. They had contributed to ending the war, possibly saving lives by making an invasion unnecessary. But they had also created weapons of mass destruction, devices that killed indiscriminately and left lingering poison in their wake. This duality could not be resolved cleanly. Most lived with ambivalence, believing they had done what was necessary while also recognizing the terrible power they had unleashed. Some became activists for nuclear disarmament and international control. They argued that atomic weapons were too dangerous to remain under national control, that the world needed institutions to prevent nuclear war. Others continued weapons work, believing that deterrence required maintaining and improving atomic arsenals. The community that had been unified during the project fractured afterward along these lines. Public reaction to the bombs was complex. Initially, there was jubilation in America and allied nations that the war had ended. The destructive power was acknowledged but not dwelled upon. The focus was on victory and the return of soldiers. But as photographs from Japan circulated, as survivors' stories emerged, as the reality of radiation sickness became clear, unease grew. Questions began to be asked about whether the bombs had been necessary, whether Japan would have surrendered anyway, whether using them on cities was morally justified. These debates would continue for decades, never reaching consensus. The Manhattan Project scientists found themselves at the center of arguments they could not escape. Their work had opened the atomic age, and they would forever be associated with it. Some embraced this role, speaking publicly about nuclear dangers. Others retreated into privacy, unwilling to relitigate decisions made under wartime pressure. For Los Alamos itself, the end of the war meant transformation. The remote laboratory became a permanent installation, continuing weapons development through the Cold War and beyond. The town that had been temporary became permanent, growing from a few thousand wartime residents to a larger community. The secrecy remained, though the location was eventually acknowledged. Los Alamos became synonymous with nuclear weapons, a place where terrible power was created and refined. The Manhattan Project's legacy was profound and multifaceted. It demonstrated that large-scale scientific projects could achieve goals that seemed impossible. It showed how government, military, and scientific institutions could collaborate under pressure. It proved that theoretical physics could have immediate practical applications. But it also raised questions about scientific responsibility, about the relationship between knowledge and power, about whether some discoveries should be pursued even if they can be. The atomic bomb was not inevitable. It required specific historical circumstances, a war creating urgency, governments willing to fund speculative research at enormous scale, scientists willing to work on weapons, and a target that justified use. Remove any of these factors and the bomb might not have been built when it was, or perhaps at all. But once the physics was understood, once fission was discovered, the possibility existed. The Manhattan Project turned possibility into reality faster than anyone outside the project imagined possible. The scientists involved carried their experiences differently. Some maintained that they had been right to build the bomb and that its use was justified. Others came to regret their participation, feeling that they had been naive about how the weapon would be used or what it would mean for the future. Still others held both positions simultaneously, believing they had done right at the time while also recognizing the terrible consequences. What united them was the knowledge that they had been present at a hinge point in history. Before the Manhattan Project, warfare had limits imposed by the energy available in chemical explosives. After it, entire cities could be destroyed in seconds. The scale of potential destruction had changed fundamentally. They had made this change, intentionally, methodically, working problem by problem until the seemingly impossible became actual. They had built the atomic bomb. In the months immediately following Japan's surrender, the Manhattan Project began its quiet dissolution. Scientists departed Los Alamos in waves, eager to return to normal academic life. The urgency that had held the community together disappeared. Without a war to win, without an enemy to fear, the justification for sacrifice eroded. People wanted to go home, to see families they had been separated from, to resume careers that had been interrupted. The infrastructure built so rapidly during the war now seemed excessive. Oak Ridge and Hanford continued operating because plutonium production required continuous reactor operation, but the massive workforce shrank dramatically. Thousands of workers who had appeared in 1943 and 1944 now left, dispersing back to wherever they had come from. The cities built from nothing began contracting, though they did not disappear entirely. General Groves and the military administrators who had overseen the project faced questions about its future. Should atomic weapons production continue? Should the facilities be maintained? What about international control? The immediate post-war period was characterized by uncertainty. The United States had a monopoly on atomic weapons, but this was recognized as temporary. Soviet scientists understood nuclear physics. It was only a matter of time before other nations developed their own bombs. Oppenheimer left Los Alamos in October 1945. He had stayed long enough to help with the transition but was eager to depart. He accepted a position as director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, a prestigious academic position that would allow him to return to theoretical physics. But he would never truly escape the Manhattan Project. His role as scientific director made him one of the most recognizable figures associated with the atomic bomb. This visibility would define his post-war life. Before leaving, Oppenheimer met with President Truman. The meeting did not go well. Oppenheimer reportedly told Truman that he felt he had blood on his hands because of the bombs. Truman's response was dismissive. He told Oppenheimer that responsibility for using the bombs was his, Truman's, not the scientists'. After Oppenheimer left, Truman reportedly told an aide that he did not want to see that crybaby scientist again. The incident illustrated the gap between those who made weapons and those who decided to use them. Many Manhattan Project scientists became involved in policy discussions about atomic energy and weapons. They had expertise that was rare and valuable. The government needed their advice on technical matters. But the scientists discovered that their technical knowledge did not automatically translate into political influence. Decisions were made by politicians and military officers who had their own priorities. Scientists could advise, but they did not control outcomes. The debate over international control of atomic energy consumed much attention in 1946. The question was whether atomic weapons could be prevented from proliferating through international agreements and institutions. The Acheson-Lilienthal report, with significant input from Oppenheimer, proposed a system of international ownership and control of all dangerous nuclear materials and facilities. The idea was that no single nation would possess atomic weapons. Instead, an international authority would control atomic energy, using it for peaceful purposes while preventing military applications. The proposal was idealistic and probably unworkable given post-war tensions. When presented to the United Nations as the Baruch Plan, it had been modified in ways that made it unacceptable to the Soviet Union. The Soviets were unwilling to submit to international inspections or give up the possibility of developing their own weapons. The Americans were unwilling to surrender their existing weapons until an inspection regime was in place. The mutual suspicion doomed the effort. The opportunity for international control, if it ever truly existed, passed quickly. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb, ending American monopoly. The test came sooner than many American officials had expected, partly because Soviet espionage had provided crucial information from the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who had worked at Los Alamos, had been passing secrets to Soviet intelligence throughout the project. Other spies had also provided information. The extent of espionage would only become clear years later, causing recriminations and a search for who was responsible for security failures. The Soviet bomb test changed the strategic situation fundamentally. The atomic bomb was no longer an American advantage. It was now a reality of international relations. Both superpowers possessed weapons capable of destroying cities instantly. This mutual capability led to the doctrine of deterrence, the idea that neither side would use nuclear weapons because the other could retaliate. This logic would dominate Cold War strategic thinking for decades. In this context, weapons development continued and accelerated. The Manhattan Project had built fission bombs, but physicists knew that even more powerful weapons were theoretically possible. Fusion bombs, also called hydrogen bombs or thermonuclear weapons, could be thousands of times more powerful than fission bombs. The principle was to use a fission bomb as a trigger to create conditions hot and dense enough for hydrogen nuclei to fuse, releasing enormous additional energy. Debate over whether to pursue the hydrogen bomb divided the scientific community. Some, including Oppenheimer, argued against it. They felt that fission bombs were already too destructive, that hydrogen bombs would be weapons of genocide without legitimate military purpose. Others, including Edward Teller, who had advocated for fusion research throughout the Manhattan Project, pushed hard for development. They argued that if such weapons were possible, America needed them before the Soviets developed their own. The political decision went against Oppenheimer's recommendation. President Truman authorized hydrogen bomb development in 1950. Oppenheimer's opposition did not stop the program but damaged his relationship with political and military leaders. His influence waned. He remained a respected figure, but his advice was increasingly unwelcome among those who favored aggressive weapons development and confrontational Cold War policies. By the early 1950s, the atmosphere had changed dramatically from the wartime collaboration of the Manhattan Project. The Cold War created suspicion and paranoia. Loyalty investigations became common. Scientists who had attended leftist meetings in the 1930s or who had friends with communist sympathies were viewed with suspicion. The openness that had characterized much of the Manhattan Project seemed naive in retrospect. Compartmentalization and security obsession intensified. Oppenheimer himself became a target. In 1954, his security clearance was revoked after hearings that examined his pre-war associations and his post-war opposition to certain weapons programs. The hearings were humiliating and vindictive, destroying his influence in government policy. The man who had led the Manhattan Project successfully was now branded a security risk. The irony was bitter. The project that had defined his life ultimately led to his public disgrace. The revocation of Oppenheimer's clearance sent a message throughout the scientific community: dissent on nuclear weapons policy could carry severe consequences. Many scientists self-censored, unwilling to risk their careers by speaking against prevailing policy. The free debate that some had hoped would characterize post-war nuclear policy gave way to conformity and silence among those still involved in weapons work. Yet even as weapons programs expanded, some Manhattan Project veterans worked for arms control. They founded organizations like the Federation of Atomic Scientists, which advocated for international cooperation and limits on nuclear testing. They wrote and spoke publicly about nuclear dangers. They educated the public about fallout, about the risks of nuclear war, about the need for treaties limiting weapons. Their influence was limited, but they represented a persistent voice of conscience. The technology developed during the Manhattan Project found peaceful applications as well. Nuclear reactors were built for electricity generation. Radioactive isotopes were used in medicine for diagnosis and treatment. Neutron sources enabled new research techniques. The knowledge gained from building weapons proved valuable in other contexts. This dual-use nature of nuclear technology created ongoing tensions between military and civilian applications. Los Alamos continued as a weapons laboratory throughout the Cold War, designing new weapons, conducting tests, refining capabilities. The legacy of the Manhattan Project lived on there, not as history but as ongoing mission. Generations of weapons designers followed the pioneers, improving efficiency, increasing yields, miniaturizing warheads. The work that began as a desperate wartime measure became permanent institutional activity. By the late 20th century, the Manhattan Project's scientists were aging. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, appeared in documentaries. They were treated as historical figures, witnesses to a pivotal moment. Their accounts varied. Some remained proud of their contributions. Others expressed regret. Most conveyed complexity, a sense that their work had been necessary but not without moral cost. They had helped end a terrible war but had also introduced weapons that threatened humanity's survival. Oppenheimer, after his security clearance revocation, returned to academic life at Princeton. He directed the Institute for Advanced Study and continued some physics research, though never with the intensity of his earlier years. He became a symbol, representing both scientific brilliance and the moral dilemmas of the atomic age. When he died in 1967, obituaries focused heavily on his Manhattan Project role, even though that work had occupied only a few years of his life. The Manhattan Project scientists who lived into the 21st century saw a world shaped profoundly by what they had built. Nuclear weapons spread to additional nations despite arms control efforts. The Cold War ended without nuclear war, validating deterrence theory but not eliminating weapons. The United States and Russia retained thousands of warheads decades after the Soviet Union's collapse. Smaller nuclear arsenals existed in Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. The genie that the Manhattan Project released from the bottle never went back in. In retrospect, the Manhattan Project represented a turning point in the relationship between science and society. Before it, science had been largely self-directed, driven by curiosity and funded modestly. After it, science became a matter of national security and received enormous government funding. Big science, characterized by large teams, expensive equipment, and mission-driven research, became normal. The innocent age of small-scale academic research gave way to organized research and development tied closely to military and industrial needs. The ethical questions raised by the Manhattan Project never disappeared. Can scientists divorce themselves from responsibility for how their discoveries are used? Should some research not be pursued even if it is technically feasible? What obligations do scientists have to society? These questions, which seemed academic before 1945, became urgent after Hiroshima. They remain unresolved, recurring whenever new technologies with destructive potential emerge. The Manhattan Project demonstrated human capability for both technical achievement and moral ambiguity. The same intelligence that solved extraordinarily difficult physics and engineering problems was applied to creating weapons of mass destruction. The project's success proved that humans could accomplish almost anything with sufficient resources and motivation. But it also proved that technical capability does not guarantee wisdom in using that capability. The slow, methodical process by which the bomb was built, problem by problem, experiment by experiment, stands in stark contrast to the instantaneous destruction it caused. Years of patient work culminated in microseconds of violence. This temporal asymmetry is part of what makes the Manhattan Project so unsettling. So much careful thought produced something that worked too quickly for thought, whose consequences unfolded faster than human reaction time. For those who worked on the project, the dichotomy was inescapable. They had been methodical, cautious, thorough in their work. The weapon they created allowed no such carefulness in its effects. Once detonated, it destroyed instantly and completely. The control they exercised in creating the bomb could not be maintained in its use. This loss of control, the transition from careful creation to uncontrolled destruction, troubled many participants for the rest of their lives. The Manhattan Project's conclusion, if it can be said to have concluded, was not a single moment but a gradual dispersal. The concentrated effort dissipated. People went their separate ways. Institutions evolved into different forms. But the consequences persisted and multiplied. Every nuclear weapon built since owes its existence to the knowledge generated between 1942 and 1945. Every nuclear reactor, every arms control treaty, every fear of proliferation, all trace back to those years when a secret project methodically built what had never existed before. The most powerful weapon in history was not rushed. It was built patiently, piece by piece, by people who understood both the physics of atoms and the urgency of war. They succeeded because they worked slowly when slowness was needed and quickly when speed mattered. They succeeded because they collaborated despite differences and compartmentalized despite the cost to efficiency. They succeeded because they were willing to accept uncertainty and adapt when assumptions proved wrong. But success in building the bomb created questions about success itself. The project achieved its technical goals completely. Whether it achieved its moral goals, whether it made the world better or worse, whether it should have been attempted at all, these questions remain open. The Manhattan Project scientists gave humanity a new capability and a new burden. They revealed what was possible at the atomic scale and in doing so changed what was possible at the human scale. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can hold that paradox gently. The smallest structures, manipulated with utmost care, produced the largest explosions, unleashed with no possibility of care. The quietest laboratories gave birth to the loudest destruction. The most patient work enabled the most instantaneous violence. These contradictions define the atomic age and the legacy of those who brought it into being. The story of the Manhattan Project is not simple. It cannot be reduced to heroes or villains, to triumph or tragedy. It is a story of humans confronting a possibility and choosing to pursue it despite uncertainty about consequences. It is a story of knowledge accumulated slowly then applied swiftly. It is a story still unfolding, because we still live in the world that project created. Thank you for spending this time exploring how the atomic bomb came to be. Not through sudden inspiration, but through years of methodical work by people who were brilliant and flawed, confident and afraid, proud and haunted by what they built. Their story reminds us that the most profound changes often come quietly, through patience and persistence, until finally the moment arrives when everything transforms at once. Good night.